right, so our next speaker is my friend Terry O'Connor. And we're thrilled to get Terry here this year. We've been trying to get him for a couple of years. Terry's got a huge, diverse set of skills and background. It would take up too much time from his presentation for me to read all of his skill set. But not only is he an emergency room doc, but he's the head of emergency medicine for Blaine County, Idaho. He's also an enthusiastic climber. He goes over to Nepal and does medicine with the Nepalis, with the Sherpas over there. And he's really a thoughtful guy. He's a great, I'm really proud to call him a friend. And yeah, Terry's gonna talk about a feel for snow, but I think Terry's gonna also talk about some human factors and some emotions and some other things. That's helpful. So here you go, Terry.
Do you like my prop? Thanks for the intro, Lynn. It's great to be back. It's good to see some friends, and looking forward to catching up with some more of you a little later on. So make sure I've got the buttons right here. So when Lynn reached out to me again this year to see if I could make it, I was happy to have the time, and I said, well, I mean, what can I contribute? What's going to be of value? What kind of came up last year? And she said, you know, in the debrief, a lot of people were just still struggling with this concept of, gosh, I just really wish people would think about the consequences. And this obviously is a follow-up to, and a dovetail to some of the previous comments in the prior talk. And look, I've been on the receiving end in many roles in my life of consequences and accidents. And it's easy to look at this, and it's easy to have that gut check response. I mean, what were they thinking? But as years have passed, I've begun to find the better way to perhaps refine that thought is instead think, what were they feeling? And to elaborate on that a little bit, I do want to go and reference something I think many of you guys are familiar with, and I'm not going to dive deep into this, but I think it's a nice context of why we make that judgment when we're looking at these accidents. And of course, this is this kind of systems of thinking outlined by Daniel Kahneman, Nobel laureate, in his work on decision-making processes. And as a brief review, essentially, the errors that we see oftentimes, I think we attribute that they are using what Kahneman would determine a fast decision-making process, okay? This is the intuitive, perhaps based on our experience, something we've seen before. It's easy to access, it doesn't take a lot of energy. It's based on memories, but sometimes those memories can cloud our judgment as well, and if they're applied in the wrong setting, we make a mistake and it leads to some degree of folly or hazard. Of course, the argument follows that to avoid that impulse, what we need to do is recognize this as a situation where that easy thinking, decision-making process may not apply, and we need to slow down, okay? Slow down and think about all the options available in front of us. What course of action are we going to take? And also to make sure we're highlighting all the options there, we might even want to use tools like a checklist. And then once we know what all the options are, we weigh the risks and benefits of those. And at that point, we eventually get to this position where the path is clear, the most informed, well-informed choice is available to us, and that's the green light. And that's what we decide to choose. Now, I review this because I think one of the unintended misinterpretations of this theory and the use of kind of a dual process mode of making decisions is there's an unintended misunderstanding that we must separate emotion from rational decision-making. So emotion is hasty, it's our system 1. In system 2, we need to be deliberate, cool, calm, collected, and detached. But what I want to emphasize with you today is that our feelings are the very thing of decision-making. Our feelings are predictions after we weigh the costs and benefits of which door is going to offer us reward and which door perhaps has hazard. Okay? It might be a little hard to comprehend right now, but of course I'm going to illustrate with some experiments. But that feeling, of course, is based on our prior experience, right? But interestingly enough, we can watch that feeling evolve in the process of making decisions themselves. And that's what's best illustrated by something called the Iowa gambling test. Anybody familiar with this study? Heard of it? Hands up. Okay, cool. You're going to learn something. So Subjects are essentially attached to a monitor. It's like a lie detector. It measures your stress response, okay? And then they're given a task. It's a gambling task. You're given $200, and you say, hey, this is what's going to happen. We're going to give you 4 decks of cards, and you're going to draw cards from those decks, all right? Within those decks of cards, you're going to find some cards that are going to give you a reward. You're going to win some money, but there are going to be some other cards you're going to lose some money. And of course, this experiment is rigged, and it's stacked so that the first 2 decks have big wins, say 40, 50 bucks at a time, but every once in a while there's a zinger, and you have a big loss, 75 bucks. Stack 3 and 4, of course, are different. Not such big wins, 3 or 4 bucks at a time, but no big losses, and over time, overall, the winning decks. So the experiment ensues. And what do we see? Sorry, I'm going to go back here. What do we see? Well, over time, often within the first 30 cards, we're starting to see as the subjects begin to pick from those first 2 decks, and they experience that swing of big wins and then big losses, what happens with the stress monitor? It starts going up and up and up, right? And in that time, right at that time, the experimenters notice that that signal is rising. They watch this magical process occur. The behavior changes. Oftentimes well before the actual subject can explain why they're starting to pick from deck 3 and 4. So that is the process of feelings developing that are allowing them to predict what's the best course ahead. So then follows an interesting question. If we can't feel those feelings, if we're incapable of using those feelings, that somatic sense, what happens in our decision making? And that's exactly what a neuroscientist, Antonio Damasio, investigated. And he had this very unique opportunity in his experiments, and he highlighted in his book, Descartes' Error. And I know many of you read Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. Have anybody else read this book? Okay, great. He had a unique opportunity to meet a patient, and he called him Elliot. And Elliot was a very successful businessman, but then he started developing headaches, and unfortunately, it turned out he had a large brain tumor, which had to be removed. And that brain tumor was in the area of the brain, the orbital frontal cortex, which is kind of just above the eyes and behind the eyes, which is involved in processing our emotions and our feelings. He had the surgery, recovered, and initially it seemed like everything was fine as far as his cognitive faculties. But as the years ensued, he had failure after failure after failure. He could no longer perform at work, lost his job, his marriage fell apart, he married another woman that his family tried to advise him not to, that marriage fell apart, and at the point that Dr. Damasio met him, he couldn't even qualify for welfare. He couldn't even get through an interview and engage with people and convince them that he needed help, because from all outside appearances, it looked like he had intact IQ. And Dr. Damasio actually did test him and found that his IQ was totally fine, but when he started to ask him about events in his life, he seemed remarkably detached from all the bad things that happened in his life. He had no emotion about his divorces. He had no emotion about his loss of his job. And he thought to himself, here's my subject. This is the guy I've been looking for. Here's someone who knows he's got intact IQ, but he cannot feel. So there's opportunity for Dr. Damasio. And what does he want to do? Of course, he wants to subject him to this test, right? So knowing what you know, what do you think happened to Elliot when he was subjected to the exact same experiment and drew from the exact same deck of cards? What happened to his stress response as he began to pick from deck 1 and deck 2, which had the big wins and the big losses? Flatline. Nothing. No emotional response whatsoever. So how do you think that ended up affecting his subsequent behavior in the card game? He lost. He could never figure it out. He never eventually navigated. His behavior never developed to the point that he picked from the safer deck of cards. But here's the really interesting thing, is afterwards, they explained to him how the cards were stacked. The experimenter and Dr. Damasio outlined, hey, here's the number of winning cards in A, B, and C, and D deck, or 1, 2, 3, and 4. All right. So here are the big wins, here are the big losses, and here are all the steady wins. And he was able to explain easily, quickly, and succinctly, oh, I got to pick from 3 or 4. But when it came to the experiment, he was unable to perform. It was as if he knew exactly what door made sense to open, but he could not value that door. He had no emotional attachment to it. He couldn't understand that that was where the reward was, and he could not have the drive to go and actually open the door up. And that's the point about how emotions work in decision-making. Even when we're outlining the rational choice, actually taking that step to make the choice is based on our feeling, because that feeling is our prediction of what's going to happen when we make that right choice, even if we've deliberated it appropriately up to that point. So emotions and feelings, they really aren't just for the arts and humanities. They are part of our executive function in rational decision-making. Absolutely. And if you're not convinced yet, it's time to start talking some stories. And I want to tell you about the first time I killed a patient. So early in my training as a physician, I was in residency, obviously, and I was working in the trauma service. And we had just shuttled a gunshot wound to the operating room. So I was left to myself. My chief surgeon and my chief resident were off in the operating room, but I had to stay because there was another patient on the way, quick on the heels of this one. And it was a gentleman who I hadn't met, but lived in my neighborhood, who was bike commuting home late at night and was struck by a car. Knocked unconscious, but then came to, and he came to our services at the trauma center. And we did our diligent evaluation, worked him up, and thankfully he had no immediate life threats. But there was one finding that gave me a bit of pause that I hadn't seen before, and I didn't really know what to do with this at this time in my career. He had a fracture at a part of his cervical spine over there called the transverse foramen. At the transverse process, you see the right of your screen. And through that foramen, there's a blood vessel, a vertebral artery, that courses up through the neck, through the spine, and into your brain. I'd never seen this injury before. I didn't know what the implications were. He seemed totally fine. He had a totally normal neurologic exam. But obviously I looked it up because I didn't know what to do, and it seemed to be some risk that there could be damage to the vessel underlying. But at this stage in my career, in order to order that test and pursue the workup, I had to run it by my superiors, who, at that time, were in the operating room. It seemed at the time my choice was clear. I just needed to pick the middle door, give them a call, and say, hey, I'm worried about this thing. Can I order this test? It's fine. But right when I was thinking about going and opening that door, I had an emotional trigger and a feeling. And that was, before they went up to the operating room, they looked me right at the eye and they said, do not bother us unless you've got a surgery we need to do. And what had happened in my experience in that rotation in the months prior, obviously I'd learned that lesson because I'd interrupted them previously, and boy, did I hear about it. And did not feel good. I wanted to impress them. I wanted to make them feel I was independent. I wanted to make them feel that I could make decisions on my own. So I stepped away from that door, and I backed off, and I thought about alternatives. So I talked to a neurosurgical resident, and I said, hey, what do you think about this? And he looked at the scan, and he was very dismissive. He said, oh, yeah. I've never seen that happen ever in my career. Turns out he had about an extra year of experience than I did. But that was an option that seemed reasonable at the time. I could avoid the pain of having to confront my superiors. Technically, I was running it by the expert consultant for the night, so I think I was covered. So I went back and I spoke to the patient. I said, hey, good news, your spine fracture is fine. It's not unstable. You're going to recover from it just fine. And he said, oh, well, my wife's out of town. She's got to fly back, and she's going to drive in and pick me up. It was about 4 a.m. at this point. I said, well, let's not admit you to the hospital. She's just going to be here in the morning. Just have a nap. I'm getting the end of a 30-hour shift. I'm going to go home, sleep, and I'll come in and check on you after I get a little bit of a nap. So you know where this is going, of course. The next day I came in, and I heard from some of my colleagues the kind of quote you never want to hear as a physician. Hey, you remember that patient from Resuscitation Bay 3 last night? It's usually bad news. He had suffered damage to the vertebral artery, dissected it, which caused a tear, which didn't immediately cause a clot in that artery, but over the course of the night when he fell asleep, he suffered a huge stroke, a catastrophic stroke that caused excessive swelling in the posterior part of his brain. He'd never woke up. He was in a coma, had to go to emergency heroic surgery, and never recovered. And he died 2 days later. So, feelings and decisions. Previous to facing that decision to go and talk to my superiors and order that test that may have prevented that outcome, I had all these negative experiences about reaching out and talking to my superiors and interrupting them during surgery. And that was enough at that time to dissuade me from picking the right choice, even though I knew at the time, based on my research, that probably was the safest route. And my emotions led me astray in that case. Obviously now, these seem like no big deal, right? When it comes to patient safety, not a big deal compared to the prospect of having a patient die in your hands. And I think this is a lesson that all young doctors learn at some point in their training, is that at some point we have to deal with the social awkwardness, we've got to run it up the chain, we've got to do a little rabble-rousing, make people upset because the consequences are too great from not picking the right door. So are there other examples where our prior experience is colored by nothing but positive experiences, and that inappropriately biases us as well? A number of white clouds, these positive experience memories in our past that perhaps cloud our feelings a bit and lead us astray from the right door. Absolutely, and I think it looks a little bit like that. Skiing is awesome, right? That's why we're all here. And for the most part, almost every single day, every single turn, especially if it's powder, is awesome. But that is a very powerful force that we have to contend with. So another story. Just a couple years ago, I got a chance to go to Japan. I'm sure many of you here have indulged in that as well. And my friend Gavin had, just before this trip, he had just gotten word that he had a young baby girl on the way, and we wanted to celebrate that. And we also had a good friend who's a guide who had some time off between his clients and wanted to explore some new terrain. Timing was right, perfect. And it was everything we expected to be, right? Just week-long cycle of ice cream headaches and sake hangovers. Perfect. Perfect. Nothing but positive experiences. And then something changed. We won't go into the factors of what happened with the weather and the snow, but clearly we were starting to get some feedback, as pictured here when I had one of my friends do a line and we could see some activity and the snow was trying to talk to us. And we even recognized this. We regrouped over the radio and we said, hey, mindset change, okay? No longer open season. This is what's in play. This is what's out of play. I backed off of my line, picked easy terrain, stopped, peeled back, looked up at Gavin, who was coming up behind me. I saw him pause at the top of a steep rollover, commit, and trigger the slab avalanche right as I was taking some photos. Gavin ended up on top. He was okay, broke a few poles. But we regrouped, and obviously I wanted to know, what were you feeling, man? What was going through your head? We knew what door not to open. We talked about it. What did Gavin say to me? He said, man, it's this week. We're in Japan, man. It's just not happening now. This is not supposed to happen. We've had such a great week. He was colored by recent experience, but I think this was the first avalanche Gavin had ever been in, so he was colored by his past experience. He was all wrapped up in the emotion of the day, and he let go of all his fear. So his prior experience, all these white clouds, all these good feelings, all these positive associations, but just like me, unfortunately, he had to learn the hard way. He had to face and confront the fact that he almost left his partner and his unborn child without him. And clearly, it's a lesson that he'll remember from here on out. So I asked him, Gavin, is there anything else you've learned that you could have deployed that maybe prevent that from happening? And he said, oh, man, yeah, absolutely. I should have done what Will told me. Will Gadd, as you may know, is a very successful mountain athlete and has gotten away with a lot in his life. And he said, Will told me is that we're optimists when we go out in the mountain environment every single time. Just going out there, we're optimists because it's a hazardous environment. And he likes to apply the positive power of negative thinking. And this is something I think Dale had just addressed. He looks at every door, and not only does he deliberate what's going on, but then he creates kind of a mental experiment. He imagines what the worst case scenario is in every scenario, and also imagines what it would feel like to undergo that. If he launches in the wrong spot, the wind picks up, he gets thrown into a tree, or if he commits to a slope and triggers a slab avalanche and falls over a cliff, what's he gonna feel like if he leaves his wife and 2 kids without their dad? And I think that's one tool potentially we can deploy. But we still have this big volume of positive experience with skiing, and sometimes it just seems so obvious what we wanna do. Okay, I'm not sure if that's adequate enough. Okay? But what's the alternative beyond entertaining this kind of concept of worst case possibility? I think the alternative is to learn by experience, and I'm not sure that's something we all want. I asked my friend McKenna Peterson, who some of you may know, a professional skier. Her mom was a professional skier, and they've both been in multiple movies, but she had to endure an experience that changed her perception of risk. And she was willing to share her conversation with me, with you today.
My backcountry decision-making has always been based off of facts and past experiences and intuition. I had 13 years of backcountry experience and avalanche education, and I was pushing it a little bit every now and again. I had a higher risk tolerance, and sometimes it seemed worth it to me to push it just a little bit in order to find that feeling you get when you ski a fresh line, the joy and the contentment and the empowerment and finding your flow state. Sometimes it was worth it to me to push it a little bit to get that feeling. And then 2 years ago, I had to call my father's longtime girlfriend and tell her that my dad had just died in an avalanche. And I watched my brother and my sister's hearts break as their lives fell apart, and my own life shattered. And we had to figure out how to keep going. And the trauma of my dad's accident is now my everyday reality. Every day. So my backcountry decision making is still based off of facts, past experiences, intuition, but I don't have any tolerance for risk. It's not worth it to me to push it even a little bit. It never was worth it. I just didn't know. I didn't know until I lived it.
So McKenna didn't know until she lived it, and just for the sake of time, I think I'm going to work on wrapping it up here, but I just wanted to open that up for consideration because I'm not sure if there is another answer beyond that. How many of you believe, especially the experience providers out there and the educators, that we can really learn and have this feeling without that experience? How can you learn to avoid that deck of cards without drawing the zinger, pulling the big loss? And I'm not sure, and I think this is something up for discussion. Happy to talk to you later on, but I think the only other pathway to that is perhaps in storytelling. And I'm going to give some props to Lynn and Tar. Great publication, by the way, if you don't have a subscription. The Avalanche Review, yes. And she was egging on another close friend of mine, Eric Peitsch, who's a forecaster up in Montana, started their avalanche program up there at the Flathead. And Lynn had reached out to him to explain his experience in coping with the loss of his good friend Ben Parsons, who died in an avalanche accident. And Eric had caution about telling another story because I think a lot of us feel like these stories are all the same, okay? The accidents are all the same, it's just that the names change. And he felt very hesitant to try to share another story, but then Lynn egged him on, which I think is something that's quite poignant and addresses, I think, the power of the storytelling. And she said, you know, Eric, maybe you're struggling because these accidents that we and our friends are involved in don't always have data to refer to. They are visceral and painful and far-reaching, but the stories need to be told. Even if they tell the same damn message over and over again, which is how a lot of these accidents seem year after year. So I encourage you all to tell your story. I would love to hear yours. And I certainly know with my partners, we talk about how we feel. And when they come in and they check in with me about how I feel, especially if I made a mistake or an accident, I know it's not a platitude. They just want to make me feel better. I know they're trying to be a good partner. Okay? They're trying to learn from lessons I've learned without necessarily having to deal with the fate that I've had to deal with. All right, thanks for your time.
Terry used up all his time. And Terry used up some of Lori's time, but we're going to keep going. Yeah, find Terry at the bar. So